Hello, everyone. All right, so we stopped the last lecture at this slide. I kind of talked about it a little bit, where we go beyond Mendelian genetics, where you just have two genes. And this is where we're going to look at two or more genes. And we have things like epistasis and polygenetic inheritance. And these are just two situations. Your book talks about a couple of others. And let's just go ahead and dive into these. They're pretty fun. Epistasis is neat. Epistasis is where the gene at one location will affect the expression a lot of times it's the expression of a gene at another location. So probably the easiest example would be albinoism in mice. Essentially, if the mouse is going to have color or not is determined by the gene at maybe, let's say, location 1. So the gene for the production of pigment, whether or not pigment will be produced, is controlled here at this location. So basically, if pigment is produced, then the genes that are at location 2 matter. So if you have pigment that's going to get produced, then we can decide if the mouse is going to be black or brown, okay? But if the gene here on location 1 does not code for any pigment, that would make it an albino, then it doesn't matter the genes that are on location 2, because basically if it says albino, it basically makes it where these genetics are obsolete and don't matter. So essentially it is where the genes for the genes at one location will essentially affect or control the expression of genes at another location. And there's lots of examples of this. There's a really great example in your book where they talk about the color of labs. And the lab color is essentially, you could have if you know labs, you can have a brown lab, you can have a black lab, or you can have a yellow lab. And this is a wonderful example of epistasis, because basically the control or the coding for hair pigment controls whether the pigment of any color will be deposited in the hair. Okay, so if there is no pigment deposit coding, then you're going to end up with your yellow labs. So it's kind of a cool thing. And it deals with something like my gray horse. Basically, the graying gene is at one location, and it doesn't, baby horses that eventually turn white can be born chestnut, they can be born, that's red, they can be born black. But if they have the graying gene, then essentially it affects the expression of their color. And as they age, they get these this kind of rony looking, their coat ends up getting some white flecks. And eventually, by the time they're 20, they're completely white. So epistasis is cool. Again, it's where you have the gene at one location controls the expression of the gene at another location. Polygenetic inheritance, and for your test, I'm sorry to go back, for your test, you just really need to know the definition and maybe how that would look like as an example, like the gene for albinoism in mice. Okay, so polygenetic inheritance is where this is another example of where you have multiple alleles. Two or more genes will have an additive effect on a phenotype. So one thing that we think is human height is controlled by 3 different genes. Now this is going to be an example. It's actually a little more complicated, but we're going to make this example kind of easy for you. But we do think that human height is a polygenetic inheritance, that you have several genes that go together that will contribute to the overall phenotype. Another trait that we see in humans that we think is an additive effect of several genes together is going to be skin color. And that's where you can see families where their skin color varies. You could have two African Americans that have a baby that is extremely light skin toned and another baby in the same family that is darker. Okay, and then another baby that's sort of in between. So if you look here at our human height example, and you have an example in your worksheet that kind of that is sort of like this, where, okay, so if we have human height, we're gonna say that each dominant gene will add 2 inches to the total height. So if you look here, this is probably me, and again, it's a little more complicated than this for human height, but you have all recessive. So the highest you have is 5'2". Now, if you have one dominant, you're gonna add, according to this, 2 inches. So they're now 5'4". Now, if you look at this one, you have 2 dominant, you have AA. So now they're going to be 4 inches taller than this first one with no dominant that was all recessive. So now they're 5'6". 3 dominant because you have the capital letter B and you have 2 capital C's. Now we're going to add 6 inches total because you have 2 inches for each dominant allele. Okay, and then the tallest where it's all dominant, we're going to add 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 times, according to this, 2, because it's 2 inches for every capital letter. Okay, so 6 times 2 is 12. So we're going to be a full foot taller than the original that had all recessive. So that's an example of polygenetic inheritance where you have many genes coming together and it kind of becoming an additive effect. You can see a wonderful example of polygenetic inheritance in skin color, where they, in your book on page 274, I think is where it is, where they kind of show where you have just basically the effects of having heterozygotes and the number of heterozygotes that are present and the tone of the skin, okay? This is showing you here, this is our classic definition of polygenetic inheritance. Phenotype is determined by the additive effects of 2 or more genes on a single character, on a single trait. So what's the trait here? It's going to be, in this case, this is showing you skin tone. So the trait is skin tone. And you have 2 or more genes adding to that, okay? In the previous example, what was the trait? Height. That's what you see. There's one phenotypic thing, height, and you have several genes going into it. Remember, poly means many genes. So the name in itself, the Latin roots there tell you what it is. Okay, and this just shows you the phenotypes on a continuum. Okay, some other human traits that we think are associated with polygenetic inheritance, is skin color. Again, you guys like to make fun of me for the color, but that's like the Europeans spell color that way. Skin color, eye color, height, weight, and intelligence. All of these things we think are several genes contributing to that single characteristic. And if you look at families, you'll kind of see the spectrum playing itself out. Usually in families, you will have people with a variety of heights. Sometimes you'll have this random 6-foot kid and then everybody else is average. Maybe they got, and you'll have somebody say, well, they got all the tall genes. Yeah, they did. Intelligence is also, it's on a spectrum a lot of times. So you have this continuum where just depends on several genes that you inherit.